The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Friday Bonus Show. Producer Pat here with you. So last night was the fourth and final night of the 2020 Democratic National Convention, and the event was of course capped off by Joe Biden speaking and accepting the Democratic nomination for president. And I suppose it would be really embarrassing for him if he went all this way and then decided to decline the nomination, so he decided to accept it. I suppose that's a good thing for him. And, he did fine during the speech. I know there were a lot of Trumpists talking about how Joe Biden was going to collapse during the speech. There's no way that he can talk at length for so long. He did just fine, especially when it comes to the delivery and the optics. There really weren't any issues, and part of the reason for that is Joe Biden's using a teleprompter. The real question, I suppose, is will Joe Biden be able to hold his own during a debate with Trump, actually during 3 debates with Donald Trump, because debates are mostly off script. I mean, you have your talking points, but when there's those exchanges, that's just going to be off the cuff, and we don't know for sure how Biden is going to respond when he and Trump are jousting. But when you take a look back at the Biden-Bernie debate that happened, back in February, the only one that they had one-on-one with each other, Joe Biden did fine. It wasn't a great performance, but he held his own. It didn't impact the race at all, it seemed. And so I think that his delivery, the optics, they were totally fine. And then when it comes to the substance of the speech, I also thought it was a very good speech. It wasn't Barack Obama's speech, of course. That was the best speech easily of the entire convention, I would say. But Joe Biden did well. I mean, he struck the right tones, I think. Some on the left and the right have criticized the speech for not having a lot of policy substance. And, I'm definitely a policy guy. I understand that sort of critique. I like talking about the numbers and the issues one by one and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, this is Joe Biden accepting the nomination for president. It's sort of like a victory lap. It's sort of like a way to conclude the primary season and sort of unite the party in a sense. And I feel the soaring rhetoric and talking about Joe Biden's upbringing, talking about the threats that the country faces, those are all worthy things to talk about as well. So, a little bit of policy mixed in there is fine, but I understand that, this is also the time for rhetoric. This is also the time to inspire people, and I think that's exactly what Joe Biden did with his speech last night. Joe Biden, of course, talked a lot about his personal struggle. He talked about how when he was a boy, his dad had to come to him and say that he lost his job, and Joe Biden related to that to the sense of dignity that comes along with work. And it was really effective stuff, especially when tens of millions of Americans are losing their jobs, worried about losing their jobs. Biden was really able to connect with them on that in a way that Trump just can't, because Trump has never experienced anything like that. I mean, he comes from the lap of luxury, never had to struggle in his life. And Joe Biden also, of course, talked about the car crash that killed his wife and daughter when Joe Biden was a newly elected senator. He also talked about how his son, Beau, died of cancer a few years back when Joe was vice president. So it was all just very touching stuff, especially when people are dealing with loss right now, from COVID or whatever the reason is. Biden, I certainly don't agree with him on policy all the time, but he's definitely an empathetic person. He can feel pain. You can tell that. You can see that in his face when he's speaking, that he's been there. He's lived a real life. And, it's just in stark contrast to Donald Trump, who's lived this life of privilege. And, Trump lost his brother this week or last week. And it was just strange to see Trump go on Fox News right away and talk about how his brother was never jealous of him, how he really hated China for allowing the coronavirus to come here, all of these self-serving, selfish things. And it was just so cringy to see Trump talk about his brother in that way, just relate it all to himself. Joe Biden would never do that. Joe Biden actually cares about people, and he's an empathetic person. So, I think when you're having an election amongst human beings, that's an important thing to be, and I think that will help Joe Biden hopefully win the election. And, there was a good chunk of the speech also dedicated to this idea that Trump has failed, which I think is great. We can go after Trump on so many different things. There's the racism and the xenophobia. There's the ways that he's cutting different agencies and doing regulatory capture, the way that he's been able to add so many judges and justices onto the courts. And, you can definitely go after him on that stuff, the lying, everything like that. But I think it's more effective, and it seems like the Biden campaign thinks it's more effective for Biden to stick to the message that Donald Trump has failed. He talked about, Joe Biden did, the virus and how it's the worst public health crisis since 1918, and how Trump's message about it has been all over the place, terrible leadership. Joe Biden talked about the economic devastation, how that's the worst situation we've been in since the 1930s with the Great Depression. Really bad stuff, high unemployment, all that stuff. And all Donald Trump can do is talk about the stock market and pretend that we're coming back when we're really not. Joe Biden talked about how we have the worst race relations, arguably now, since the 1960s. And he also talked about the fourth crisis, which he laid out, which was climate change. And with that, we're just punting. We're not only punting for these 4 years with Trump, we're actually actively making the problem worse, by reinvesting in fossil fuels and all this stuff, and pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. So I think Joe Biden did a good job talking about those four big crises, and that was sort of like the thesis of his speech, I would say. Maybe it was a little bit too long. I started to drone out a little bit. I started to not pay attention as much, and I got the sense that maybe people did as well. But that's okay. It can be boring. It can be a boring speech as long as Joe Biden is able to hold himself together and disprove the critics who think that he's going to collapse whenever he talks. The bottom line is, though, I think these conventions, do they really matter? I mean, so much is going to happen between now and Election Day that it will define the race. I mean, when you think back to 2016, no one really remembers the conventions. I mean, there were a lot of balloons at the Democratic National Convention. I remember that. That was a big thing. And at Trump's convention, he talked about he and he alone can fix it. So, there are these sound bites that you get from the conventions, but I don't know if they'll have a major impact. Typically, the candidate will get, a few points as a boost in the polls in the first few days after the convention. So, that plays a role, but both of those candidates get a bump. So, it's sort of evens out. The fact is that a lot's going to happen between now and the actual election. And when you think back to 2016, I mean, think about what happened in October alone. You had the debates, you had the Access Hollywood tape that came out, you had the John Podesta emails get leaked, you had Comey come out and talk about how they were reopening the investigation into Hillary's emails. This is going to look like ancient history when it's actually time to vote. And that's why I don't think that the conventions really matter. It's just kind of like a celebratory thing. But maybe you disagree with that. I can understand that perspective too. And so contrast all of that, what was going on with the Democrats over these last 4 days with Donald Trump and what he's been doing. Donald Trump actually went on Hannity's show yesterday to sort of do this battling interview type thing at the same time as the convention. There was this tradition before that candidates wouldn't campaign during the conventions of their opponents, and Trump has completely done away with that tradition, of course. Honestly, I don't know why we have that tradition, but it's not like it's something that Trump would care about, that's for sure. And so Trump goes on Fox News, and he talks about, for the first half of the interview, crime in America. That was his focal point. It looks like that's what's going to be the focal point of his campaign, because he's failed when it comes to the issues that are right now most important to Americans. He's failed on coronavirus, he's failed on the economy, he's failed on healthcare, he's failed on race relations, and that's why they have to talk about crime and make it seem as though everything's out of control in these cities. Really, when you look at the crime statistics, overall crime is slightly down since the pandemic started. I guess murders and shootings are slightly up, but that only makes up 1% of crime overall. And, of course, crime has been on a precipitous decline ever since, the 1970s, 1980s. People just have this idea that it's going up. And, maybe there's a slight uptick now, but I don't think it's anything significant. Really what it is, when Republicans don't have anything to run on policy-wise, when people aren't actually motivated to go out and vote for Republicans, they have to fearmonger. And that's exactly what we saw in 2014 with Ebola. Even though only 2 Americans died of Ebola, they made a big thing about Ebola before the 2014 midterms. After the midterms, they didn't talk about it again. Same thing happened in 2018. I don't know if you remember. They talked about the migrant caravan. That was huge news right before the midterms, and then after the midterms, everyone stopped caring about the migrant caravans for whatever reason. I think that's exactly what's going on here with the crime. But it also doesn't make sense, because all of this crime is supposedly happening under Donald Trump's watch, and he's doing nothing about it. So how is re-electing him going to help matters? I have no idea. Now, of course, Trump doesn't accept any blame for it. He says it's all, the Democrats and the people who run local governments who are to blame for this. But, of course, Trump blamed Obama for crime when Obama was president, so how come he doesn't get any blame? It's all hypocrisy. We're used to that at this point. But it was just so ridiculous for him to talk about crime for half the interview. The other half of the interview, the last half, was about how the election's going to be rigged, and there's no way that Trump can lose if it's a fair election, and fear mongering about mail-in ballots and all this stuff. So it was just crazy. I mean, like, they really have nothing to run on. It's kind of pathetic, honestly. Like, I mean, I kind of feel bad in a sense. Like, they really don't have any issues that they can put in the forefront that people can connect with, that people really care about. Certainly, people care about crime, but crime's, like, always an issue. Why are they making such a big thing out of it now? And, like, voters care more deeply about these other things. It's obviously because Trump has failed. It's obviously because this is the only leg that they have to stand on, and it's a wobbly one for sure. Yeah.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.